Thank you. Got it all out of my hair? Yeah. Who deserves an education? I believe that education should be inclusive. My mission is to bring education to everyone, everywhere. Let me introduce you to Duda. Duda was born in the Kibera slums of Nairobi, Kenya. In Africa, it's common for families to pay their school fees by the month. When Duda's parents could pay, he could learn. And when they couldn't, he couldn't. This was true on and off throughout his entire education, until he got to the point where he had only one assignment left to complete to finish high school. His parents ran out of money, and he had to drop out. With just a few days to go before the semester was to end, he went all over Kibera asking anyone with a computer whether he could have just a little bit of time so he could complete his assignment and he could graduate. Finally, with time running out, a girls' school said that he could work, but not when the girls were there, and only at night. He worked straight through several nights, completed his assignment, and was able to graduate high school. When asked later, what drove you, what prompted you to keep pushing through despite everything working against you, he said, the human body is limited. The human mind has no limits. I think we can all agree that Duda deserves an education. Let me introduce you to James, not his real name. James was a violent criminal. One weekend, he kidnapped a woman, robbed her, assaulted her over several days, and stabbed her multiple times until she was paralyzed. He took her limp body to an alligator-infested swamp where he held her head underwater until he thought she was dead. She didn't die. James was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life without parole. Does James deserve an education? It's easy to talk about inclusion of the innocent, people like Duda, who through no fault of their own are striving heroically to better themselves. But what about the guilty? What about James? Does James deserve an education? I think he does. Not, of course, by virtue of anything he's done, but simply because he's human. There's a Hebrew saying that to save one life is to save the universe. And I believe this applies even to the Jameses of the world. Their lives, their minds are worth saving too. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. In 1972, the United Negro College Fund adopted this as its slogan, and it's considered one of the most effective in advertising history. Why does it so resonate with us? Well, I believe it's because we all have a deep-seated belief that every human deserves a chance to develop to their full potential. In fact, the very definition of human speaks to this. Education is at the heart of what it means to be human. The very term Homo sapiens means wise human. To be human is to be wise, or at least to be able to pursue wisdom. And when we deny people access to education, we're denying them the ability to be part of humanity. Surely we all agree that every member of our species deserves an education. Or do we? Throughout history in America and around the world, we've been ambivalent about how we treat our criminals. In 1689, as part of the Glorious Revolution, King William and Queen Mary adopted the English Bill of Rights. One of its provisions was to prohibit cruel and unusual punishment, the first time this happened in history. And this carried over into the American colonies, and finally into the American Bill of Rights as the Eighth Amendment. Now, building on this foundation, in the 19th century, America became famous as a place where criminals were rehabilitated rather than punished. In Pennsylvania, prisons were redesigned as intentional spaces where inmates were given every opportunity to reflect on their crimes, contemplate their sins, and become penitent. For the luminaries of Europe, this American idea of penitentiaries was a matter of great fascination. And the famous Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville actually came to the United States not in order to write his book, Democracy in America, but rather to write a report for the French government on the topic of this American crazy experiment and rehabilitating criminals. This continued into the 20th century. President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 signed the Higher Education Act, which extended the Pell Grant program to inmates. Inmates were included, and throughout the 1970s and 1980s, educational programs flourished in prisons all across the country. But then in 1994, President Bill Clinton, determined to demonstrate he was tough on crime, repealed the eligibility of inmates for Pell Grants. Inmates were excluded, and prison education programs disappeared all across the country. Now, just because formal college classes were no longer taking place in prisons didn't mean that other individuals and organizations could step in. And that's where our Civics program comes in. At SensibleSchool, we're engaged in a transformative program to bring education and citizenship and liberty to inmates in a maximum security environment. I'd like to share with you a little bit about what we're doing and why we're doing it. In 2016, at the South Bay Correctional Facility, the lawyer son of a Florida Atlantic University professor convinced his father to offer a series of lectures on civics. Now, normally such programs are restricted to those who have 5 years or left on their sentences, but in this case, civics was open to everyone. When the program was coming to a close at the end of 12 weeks, however, something quite remarkable happened. So transformed were they by what they were learning that the inmates refused to graduate. So what was supposed to be a one-time 12-week series of lectures was quickly transformed into a 48-week certificate program in civics, ethics, economics, and literature. The room where civics is held can hold 120 inmates, and the program consistently fills the room. It's now completing its 6th year. When I first went to South Bay, I was given an opportunity to meet James. James is an incredible student. He has been transformed by civics and has now been in prison for 36 years. As a result of this program, his mind is not being wasted. Now, the experiment in penitentiaries was actually a failure. Inspired by the Quaker idea of silent worship, inmates were placed in solitary confinement. Everyone in the facility wore masks, including the guards, so that inmates could not see any other human faces. The only exception was the chapel, which was custom built with individual cells, such that only the pastor could see and only he could be seen. And only his voice was heard by inmates, often for years at a time. We now know that such isolation leads to mental breakdown. Inmates became animals, and many went insane. Solitary confinement is now only used as a means of punishment or in cases where safety considerations demand it. But when we deny education to inmates, I believe we're doing something very much like putting them in solitary confinement. We constrict their minds and we limit their worldview. In fact, I think it's the case that denying access to inmates could be every bit as cruel and unusual as physical punishment. Now, the first time I went to South Bay, I was given a tour of the facility, and I lectured to the class, and then I was given an opportunity to talk one-on-one with a number of individual inmates about what the program meant to them. Before civics, I was angry, bitter, and frustrated, one of them told me. As a result of civics, I've learned that being a citizen requires caring for and about others. Before civics, I was wild and out of control. As a result of civics, I've learned that discipline is part of living a fully human life. Before civics, I thought the world owed me. As a result of civics, I now realize that with liberty comes responsibility, and if I want to be free, I must learn to be responsible. One of the inmates I talked to, we'll call him Kelvin, was bursting with enthusiasm to share all the things that he had learned back in his home community. I know I'm responsible for my crimes, he said, but no one ever taught me these things. If they had, maybe I wouldn't be here in the first place. I want to go back to my community and I want to share what I've learned because maybe I can keep others from ending up where I did. Kelvin looked young, and so I asked him how long he'd been in prison. 15 years, he said. Thinking about how much good he could do back in his community, I asked him how much more time he had on his sentence. 15 years, he said. Should Kelvin be denied an opportunity to learn the relationship between liberty and responsibility? Should his mind be wasted? Now, the second time that I went, I was given a chance to talk to the whole class again, and I asked them to explain to me not simply what it meant to them as individuals, but to explain how the prison had changed as a whole as a result of civics. And a number of inmates got up and they shared stories along the lines of, before civics, we would talk about girls and sports and cars and girls and girls. As a result of civics, we listen to the news and we talk about what's going on in Tallahassee and we talk about what's going on in Washington and what it means for this country and for our state and for the community. That wouldn't have happened without civics. Then an inmate stood up and he said, "You might not know this, but this prison has a problem with illegal drugs. And many of us know that we're not going to be released for a very long time. But we decided we don't have to wait until we're released to begin practicing responsibility. So we've decided together and on our own that we're going to try to do something about this illegal drug problem." That wouldn't have happened without civics. Then one inmate stood up. He was wearing a kufi, and he asked another inmate to stand and another one. And he said, "I'm a Muslim, and he's a Christian, and he's a Jew. When we have free time, we get together and we talk about what we're learning in class. And I would challenge you to find another prison in this country where a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew can be friends." I think there is value in bringing education to these people, regardless of what brought them into prison in the first place, and regardless of when, if ever, they're going to be released. At SensibleSchool, we're working to bring civics to prisons all across the country, including in Indiana. And the Pell Grant program has been recently reauthorized to make inmates eligible. We're working to make civics part of an accredited college program. After he graduated from high school, Duda was given a full scholarship to the Tuna Panda Institute, a tech training program in which he flourished and even became an instructor for some time. He's now working as a software coder, and he's doing really well. James was recently transferred to another facility. As soon as he got there, he began lobbying for the extension of civics into his new home. A class was open for 35 inmates and is going to be starting soon. And as a result of James' advocacy and enthusiasm, 80 inmates signed up. It'll be our third facility in Florida. Our mission is to bring education to everyone, everywhere. Every mind, is a terrible thing to waste. Thank you very much.